And so for me, bringing Behind the Big House to Arkansas was a way to engage in sustained conversations about race and slavery across the state. And we held the 3rd annual program in March of this year, but I'm going to go back to 2015 and tell you about how we got started. And so I had a few questions to take into consideration in order to get this going. And so the first one was, how will I fund it? Who are my partners? Who is the audience? What are the goals? And what will the program look like? And so I'm an archaeologist with the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, and we have 10 research stations located around the state. And our mission is to conduct research, preserve archaeological collections, and share what we learn with the public. And I debated whether to create the program as an Arkansas Archaeological Survey event behind the big house with a sleepover with Joe McGill and food by Jerome Baez could have easily aligned with the archaeology of the plantation. And this could have been a multi-year project that emphasized the archaeology of Hollywood and helped develop interpretation of the site. But I had some other networks and resources, so I took those into consideration because I'm also on the board of an organization called Preserve Arkansas, and it's a statewide nonprofit that advocates for historic preservation. It works to build stronger communities by reconnecting Arkansans to our heritage and empowering people to save and rehabilitate historic places. And they do this through education, advocacy, and technical assistance. And so Preserve Arkansas lists the state's most endangered places. It celebrates the best historic preservation efforts across the state, takes people on rambles to learn about important historic places, and provides technical assistance about the economic and social benefits of preservation and restoration. But there was also an interest in developing new programs to reach wider audiences. And so I brought up the possibility of creating this event in Arkansas to the board. And it was pretty easy to convince them by sharing articles about Joseph McGill and the Slave Dwelling Project in Smithsonian Magazine, and telling them that the National Humanities Alliance calls Behind the Big House in Holly Springs they labeled it as an engaged humanities model program to cultivate vibrant local humanities communities. And so this was, pretty, just being able to say that about Behind the Big House in Holly Springs went over pretty well with our funders and well as the board. They're thinking, we want to be doing something like that. But the big questions were where to hold it, and what would the program look like? Where could we find a slave dwelling for Joe to sleep, and somewhere for a cook to prepare food? We thought it was important to identify a slave dwelling where someone knew about its history. My colleague, Dr. Jamie Brandon, suggested historic Washington State Park in southwest Arkansas. So if you can picture that state all the way at the bottom, like towards Texarkana, where you might know where Bill Clinton's boyhood home is. It's nearby, near Hope, Arkansas. But he thought that historic Washington would be a good location. We've been doing archaeology at Sanders Kitchen, and it seemed like that would be a good spot to test this out. And so Jamie put me in contact with Josh Williams at Historic Washington, and I wrote up a preliminary program, a preliminary overview of what we were thinking about doing, and asked if we could hold it there. I also asked, would they be interested in partnering with us on a grant? What would our expenses be? Could they provide a tour? And would they consider donating the use of space and the tours as part of the cost share in a grant? And they said yes. We also wanted to partner with the Black History Commission of Arkansas, since they work to raise awareness of contributions and impacts that Black Arkansans have made to our history. And I want to tell that one of the things that says on the slide that I didn't put in this is, to consider, weigh out who are your important networks, where do you have resources. Consider your partners. Ask for what you want, and then if they say no, they say no. But make that ask. And so I knew Carla Coleman, the president of the Black History Commission, because I attended the Preservation of African American Cemetery conferences, and she invited us to present our proposal to the board. And Preserve Arkansas's then executive director, Vanessa McEwen, attended the board meeting and asked the commission if they would be interested in partnering with us for this program. And they voted unanimously to join us. And so we were able to secure partnerships through our preservation network. So we had a location, we had partners, but we also, at this point, had lots of expenses. And so we have Joe McGill traveling from South Carolina. And although he loves what he does, we can't expect him to do this project for free. And there are travel costs for Joe, for our other presenters, and Preserve Arkansas staff. There's also food, advertising, and printing of programs, and other promotional materials. In order to get this project moving, we needed some money. And Preserve Arkansas often charges for our events, but we thought Behind the Big House should be free in order for a wider audience to be able to attend. And so we applied for a grant with the Arkansas Humanities Council. And here, I think it's helpful to have someone with some grant writing experience, but with or without a grant writer, there are a few things to take into consideration to improve your possibilities. One, don't wait until the last minute. A good grant application takes time, and as we experience, there's always last-minute details that to wrap up. Granting agencies like to know that you are following their guidelines, so try to provide all of the information it asks for, including a detailed budget and a proposed agenda. For this grant, it meant showing how the program included humanities content. And this often seems a little daunting, but we did this in two ways. We provided the agenda, and we said archaeology and history are humanities-based disciplines that have the potential to expand knowledge about the people who were enslaved in Arkansas. This program focuses upon slave dwellings as important historic structures, the role of African American foodways in interpreting these structures, and the interpretation of African American lives in historic sites and museums. This showed the reviewers that we had thought this had a broad humanities base, and we also had a plan to make this an annual event and to show its long-term impact. The Humanities Council also wants to know that they are funding a scholarly event, and since we included someone who knew about the site's history, we had this covered. If there's a little known about your site, look at your regional universities. Are there historians or did I turn off the mic? No, okay. Or, because could. Okay, are there historians or archaeologists doing research on African American life? We even added the expenses of doing some additional research in 2017. So if you don't know a lot about a site, there's always still the potential to include that. And if you've invited Joe McGill, you have a humanities scholar right off the top. And so, and if you're working at a museum or something, but this is easily to do, is to line up a crew of humanities scholars. And the Behind the Big House program in Arkansas looks pretty different than the one created by Chilius and Jennifer here in Holly Springs. And this was partly because I partnered with Preserve Arkansas, and a program in a small town where I live or at Hollywood Plantation would look different. Since it's a big part of our audience would be Preserve Arkansas members, public interpretation specialists, museum curators, historic preservationists, educators, and members of the public interested in the history of historic Washington specifically and African American history more broadly, the free two-day event followed a model which Preserve Arkansas often utilizes with professionals offering information to attendees. And I think our program is a little more dynamic than this sounds, because when I asked Gemma Best, the executive director of the Humanities Council, when I was preparing this, I'm like, so why do you continue to fund this project? And she said, it's because of the unique way that we involve the audience. So even though I think we are doing we have a speaker series, which I'll tell you a little bit more about, that we are presenting information, but that there is also a dynamics and a interaction with our groups. And I wish you could see it because it looks beautiful, I think, but so you can. I'll show you after. And so I'll come back to this later about audience. And we had a little over 50 people. So in our grant, we said we would reach between 50 and 100 people. I mean, think about that. We are in Southwest Arkansas. If you know anything about Arkansas, there's Little Rock in the center, there's Fayetteville, and then it's the pretty rural and small towns. And so that we got that many people to travel to historic Washington, we felt pretty good about that. So a little over, we said between 50 and 100, and a little over 50 showed up our first year. And so be realistic, but be optimistic for attendance, and also consider offering incentives for people to come. We offer Department of Education professional development credits for educators in order to encourage that attendance by teachers. So the first Behind the Big House program was held in Arkansas in May 2016. It was a collaboration between Preserve Arkansas, the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, Arkansas State Parks, the Black History Commission, and the Slave Dwelling Project. And it was supported by the Arkansas Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And it highlighted the important contributions African Americans made in Arkansas history, offered guidance for historic preservationists who sought to preserve slave dwellings, and recommendations for museums and historic sites to interpret them. And so Friday night, we had a cocktail hour at the Sanders Kitchen. And Jerome Baez prepared a beef and okra gumbo and sweet potato pone based on enslaved foodways. And Joe McGill discussed the slave dwelling project and with attendees, and later slept in the Sanders Kitchen. On Saturday, Dr. Jamie Brandon talked about the archaeology and history of historic Washington. I introduced people to Project Archaeology as a teaching tool for educating young people about slavery. Joe McGill provided a lecture about the Slave Dwelling Project, and Jerome Baez talked about the development of the Foodways program at Stagville Stagville State Historic Site, and how they established that program to attract more African American visitors. And Dr. Jodi Skipper joined us and highlighted the important issues encompassing heritage tourism, development in the southeastern United States, and how representations of various racial groups are confronted and conflicted in historic site interpretations. The Historic Washington staff provided a tour, and we had lunch in the gardens there. And so, as I said, about 50 people attended our first year, and one of the hurdles that we faced was Historic Washington was really uncomfortable with Joe and anybody else sleeping in the Sanders Kitchen. They relaxed once they met him, and Jerome and I both slept in the kitchen that night, but the attendees who came wanted that experience, and this is we'll see later. We have very few people saying, but this year when nobody could, everybody wanted to. And so we needed to, for year two, we needed to figure out ways to make this happen. And then we also realized that we needed to figure out a way to interest more African American people as over 75% of our attendees were white. For year 2, I passed the organizing on to Dr. Blake Wintry at Lakeport Plantation. And this was one of the hardest but most important lessons for me. I had to let go of the program and let it be molded by our partners, because if we were going to bring this project to new locations, we had to utilize the different resources and networks available in each area. And I admit to having very petty thoughts about all of the work I'd put into that first year's grant proposal and handing it over, where Blake, all he had to do was plug in the new information and send that off. It was really, really a hard thing for me to let go. But I learned by doing that, by putting my ego aside and letting it go, that we were completing our mission of continued conversations about the history of enslaved people and slave dwellings in Arkansas. And we were letting the program grow and expand to reach new audiences and explore different aspects of the history of slavery in Arkansas. So let me tell you a little bit about how the program changed and stayed the same. The 2017 program was held at Lakeport Plantation in southeastern Arkansas. And so, you know where Greenville, Mississippi is? Then it's just on the other side of that Mississippi River Bridge. There's Lakeport Plantation. And so Lakeport is an 1859 plantation owned by Arkansas State University's Heritage Sites program. And so, and Dr. Blake Wintry, the director, is also a Preserve Arkansas board member. And so where I created the 2016 program to include archaeology, Blake focused on the event on primary sources, WPA slave narratives, deeds, and pension records, as well as genealogy and living history. It remained the same, in which on Friday night, Jerome Baez prepared gumbo and strawberry shortcake, and Joseph McGill slept in the Lakeport kitchen. But we added the Voices in the Past, a living history troupe. On Saturday, we included presentations by Jody Skipper about race and heritage tourism, as well as presentations by Joseph McGill and Jerome Baez. In addition, Angela Walton Raji, a historian and specialist in African American and Native American genealogy, gave a lecture on identifying primary sources to learn about the lives of the enslaved. And Blake included some research on pension files at the National Archives in the 2017 grant, and he gave a talk about what he learned about enslaved laborers at Lakeport from those documents. And during lunch, the Voices in the Past group portrayed the lives of enslaved laborers from Chico County, which is the county Lakeport is located in, based on WPA slave narratives. Attendees really liked learning about the primary sources they might use to do their own research. Lakeport was limited to 50 people, so because of the space inside the house for the speaker series, and we were at capacity. So we knew that for 2018, we needed a bigger location. Jodi Morris, a park ranger at Central High National Historic Site in Little Rock, brought 5 Central High students to Lakeport, and they slept at the site that night. And we knew from that experience, we wanted to see more young people reached at these programs. So we had the number of African American attendees increased a little bit, but we still needed to think about how to involve more African American people and increase our diversity. For year 3, we moved to the Brownlee Kitchen at Historic Arkansas Museum in Little Rock, so we moved to the center of the state. And this museum is a living history museum that includes historic buildings from Little Rock's founding in the 1830s. And it had an auditorium that seated 120 people, and we were in the center of the state. So we had really big ideas about how we were changing this. So the program maintained its core components with Joseph McGill, Jerome Baez, and Jodi Skipper. On Friday, Jerome cooked a feast of roast chicken, collard greens, and cornbread. And Joe talked about the slave dwelling project and slept in the Brownlee kitchen. And Aisha Credit and Felicia Richardson, living history actors at Historic Arkansas Museum, performed their characters, including Tabby, an enslaved laborer owned by the Brownlees. On Saturday, I talked about the archaeology of the Brownlee house and what it can tell us about Tabby's life. Aisha and Felicia performed two of their characters from other sites in Little Rock, and they also talked about how they got into character and did the research and writing required to do living history of urban enslaved laborers. And I think that was one of the best parts of 2018. Historic Arkansas Museum staff talked about the artifacts housed at the museum that they knew were made by enslaved craftspeople, and you could get to see them. Jerome talked about his experience with archaeologists at Monticello in Virginia and how this informed his cooking. And Joseph talked about the slave dwelling project, and Jodi talked about Behind the Big House and slavery and race in Mississippi. We had the best turnout with the most diverse audience. And this program was really great. But I think we offered more information, more content, and fewer tools. Where I had talked about ways to incorporate slavery into the classroom, and Jerome had talked about building a foodways program in year 1. And Blake provided tools for doing research in year 2. In year 3, the presenters, myself included, offered lots of information, but fewer tools in order for people to do their own research or for education or preservation. And people who were there, they can, Jodi's been to multiple, but if you can let me know what you think if I'm right here. We were worried about having too many people attend. People signed up in advance for the Friday night programming, and so we felt we were at capacity of how many people we could serve food, and we had to turn people away when there was, as we were getting close, and Arkansas Times did a story, and so all of a sudden a lot of people who didn't know about it wanted to come, and so we had people we turned down, and then not everybody showed up, and so how to negotiate this, especially if you're going to serve food at a free event. How do you make sure that that you have enough food for everybody, and then you have you will have enough people sign up, but then what do you do if people don't show up? And then, because we felt like all those people we had to turn away at the last minute, we were sad that they couldn't be there. So something we're still trying to figure out. We're thinking that we're going to, so we've been moving around the state for the first 3 years, and we think we're going to stay in Little Rock in 2019 so that we can improve that program rather than building a new one. We learned that students weren't just going to come. We need to develop programming, especially for school groups, and share this information with educators. We also, fewer people stay the night. And so we're thinking about how to ensure that more people experience this important part of the program. So let me say, I'm pretty proud of what we have created, but I also want to take a few minutes to reflect critically on what we've learned. The goals for Behind the Big House have changed each year. It's not a cookie cutter model that we can pick up and take to a different location. We are constantly thinking about how to make it better. I check out what my colleagues are doing to get new ideas, and we utilize the resources and networks in each location. From our programming, we recognize that we need to be careful not to let it become a top-down program with one-sided sharing of information, with the professionals providing content to the audience. In the upcoming years, we intend to include more panels and other formats to create more dialogue. We are thinking about ways to provide more useful tools for people to do their own research or develop their own programs. I'm talking to the Butler Center, which is a research center in downtown Little Rock, about a StoryCorps-like component where people could record their stories. We are thinking about changing up our format a little bit to reach more students. We are considering having tours for high school students or junior high students that highlight the awesome living history actors at Historic Arkansas Museum and Jerome Baez's food preparation. Our friend Joseph Bruschke, who you've met, is a food educator, and this would be a way to incorporate his skills into the program. And we're considering borrowing from Montpelier's Talking to the Ancestors program and including a fireside. I don't know if Little Rock's going to let us have fireside, so I put that in quotes, but fireside conversation about slavery and race on the program. There's also the more troubling issues with audience and goals that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about. We used our different networks as Preserve Arkansas, the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, Arkansas State Parks, Historic Arkansas Museum, and the Black History Commission. For example, these organizations have broad networks, including members, volunteers, and connections with local, state, and federal agencies. We publicized the event on KUAR, a national public radio station, social media, newspapers, and on educator and history listservs. We offered educators professional development credit, and so it was advertised in those catalogs. And so we've been trying to reach as wide as audience as possible, but our audiences have been predominantly white. From feedback from this year's program, we're going to try some new promotional ideas for 2019. So we're going to identify African American radio stations and churches as a way to reach a wider audience. And as we think about reaching a more diverse audience, we also have to evaluate why we're doing this. For me, Behind the Big House is as much about social justice as it is about teaching history. For the 2018 planning, we had a discussion of whether to include Jodi Skipper's presentation again. And some committee members said that people had seen that and they didn't need to hear it again. I disagreed, and I argued that Jodi's contribution was one of the most important parts as she encourages us to think about race and our role in remembering the legacy of slavery. Jodi's work encourages us to think about the ways a program like Behind the Big House might lead to change and reconciliation. And this is an uncomfortable but important discussion. Let me use a story to delve into it a little bit. I think I'm going to slaughter his name, but Chinjari Kumanika and Jack Hick created this podcast, Uncivil. In a recent episode, they explore the history of the song Dixie. And they talked to Justin Robinson with the Carolina Chocolate Drops. And Robinson is from North Carolina, and he plays the banjo, which you may know originates in Western Africa. And Robinson learned to play from an African-American man who learned from his father, who learned from his grandfather. And for the Carolina Chocolate Drops play old-time music to share its black tradition. For a while, they played Dixie without the lyrics and a way to reclaim the song. This anthem of the Confederacy was popularized by a white man, Daniel Emmett, who performed it in minstrel shows in New York in the late 1850s. After learning it from his neighbors, the Snowdens, an African-American family band from Ohio. When asked about playing this song, Robinson said, "What does it mean for a black person to be playing this song that was probably written by a black person, but in the middle period has been co-opted by white supremacist ideology, that's weird. Like, that's a weird sandwich. And I wanted people to sit in that, and I wanted to set it firmly on people's plates so they could regard it and have their own reactions to it.